There is something profound in music, there's something profound in life, there's something profound in nature, and we happen to be alive on this day to appreciate it and to be together where we can take the strands of life, the talents that we have, the love we have to share, the memories, and weave it all together so we can bless our little ones, so that we can share our music and our voices, and so that we can truly be together celebrating the light and the beauty of life. Today's a turning point. It is literally a turning point, physically, in our world. When the sun rose this morning, even though none of us could see it because of the clouds here in Tulsa, it rose after the darkest day of the year. There were only 9 hours and 32 minutes of sun yesterday. Since June, the sun has been staying in the sky for shorter and shorter amounts of time. The nights have been becoming progressively longer and longer until we came to yesterday, the longest night of the year. And if you didn't have electricity like many here in the city, it was even longer. In ancient times, at this point in the season, people were terrified. They didn't know what was going on. They thought the sun was dying or in jeopardy of being extinguished. So they invented elaborate rituals to try to reignite the sun or entice it to stay. In China, the emperor would ascend to the Temple of Heaven in Beijing and offer burnt sacrifices as an intermediary between heaven and earth to keep the sun from burning out or going away. In Peru, the Incan priests high up in the Andes Mountains held a religious ceremony in honor of the sun god Inti. It was for the purpose of tying the sun to the earth so that it could not escape. In Machu Picchu, to this day, there stands a large column of stone, which is known in the traditional language as the hitching post of the sun. And it was used in solstice ceremonies for tethering the sun to the earth. In ancient Rome, there was a celebration called Dies Natalis Solis Invictus, which means the birthday of the unconquerable sun. And that is sun spelled S-U-N. This ceremony, the birth of the sun, took place on what day do you think? Any guesses? December 25th, right. And it incorporated this birthday of the sun ceremony and holiday in the Roman Empire, incorporated the rituals of sun gods from various peoples across this vast empire. It incorporated the Syrian sun god Elagabal, also Sol, the god of Emperor Aurelian, and Mithras, the Persian god. And under Aurelian, the birthday of the sun, S-U-N, on December 25th became an empire-wide holiday. And it was his attempt to unify the people in this incredibly diverse and enormous empire under a single holiday, without forcing each of them to reject their local deities. With the growing popularity of Christianity in the 3rd century, Jesus of Nazareth began to receive much of the same recognition that had previously been given to the sun gods in many of these communities. And soon, Jesus became a part of the tradition of Solis Invictus on December 25th. Throughout the empire. A few decades later, under Emperor Constantine, the other deities were eventually subsumed under the worship of Jesus, and the 25th of December became the birthday of the sun, spelled S-O-N, the Son of God. Christianity became the official religion of the empire, and that is how December 25th became to be the day recognized as Jesus' birthday. Scholars have no earthly idea what actual day he was born. But the winter solstice, of course, is the perfect time to celebrate the birth of the light of the world, or the birth of hope into the world, seasonally. It makes absolutely perfect sense. Now keep in mind that starvation was common during the first months of winter for much of human history. In the northern hemisphere, these were known as the famine months. It was dark, it was cold, it was a scary time. And if you've ever experienced the dark night of the soul, or hit bottom in your life, you know all too well what it feels like to fear that your life is coming to an end, or your life as you know it has ended. If you're the kind of person who prays to God and you've had that experience, like, where is God? God is nowhere. I am alone and suffering, and I can't feel any connection. If you've experienced this kind of dark night of the soul in your life, then you know that the first day of hope after a long period of darkness is a wonderful day. That first sense of connection to what's good and possible. Now, if we attune ourselves to the seasons as ancient people did and as rural societies still do, today is the first sunrise after the winter solstice, and it represents for many that experience of the birth of hope, the birth of light, a sign of connection to possibility after a long, dark period of descent. As you can imagine, some people who know that All Souls is not a typical church, people who have heard that people at All Souls finds inspiration in many different places and religions and holy days and theologies and traditions, including finding inspiration in the natural world itself, will ask me sometimes, how could nature possibly be a source of inspiration in the way that traditional religions offer that kind of inspiration and rhythm for people's lives? Now, one of the ways that people find spiritual and personal guidance through nature is by seeing the cycles and the seasons as bearers of wisdom. Winter solstice is a perfect example, and so today I want to lift up how one can understand the rhythms and cycles of life as bearers of hope and wisdom and possibility in our lives. Now, while Christians will look to the Bible for inspiration and stories, and Jews to the Torah, and Hindus to the Bhagavad Gita and the other Vedas, a naturalist or a humanist often looks to nature. Anyone who has lived through a tragedy or a major crisis or the death of a relationship or a diagnosis that changed everything, or hit bottom as an alcoholic or an addict, or has found themselves in unimaginable and unescapable debt, knows what it's like to be so far down in the valley that we can't even imagine a way out. But just like the religious traditions show us through the calendars of rituals and holy days, the seasons and the solstice remind us that life does not happen linearly. Let me see if I can say this right. Linearly. Okay. You can applaud, that's all. Linearly. It happens in cycles. Nature, like religion, reminds us that there is no such thing as a permanent descent. It's impossible. Even the ocean has a bottom. It is physically impossible to always be in a descent. And it is spiritually impossible too. If we hang on, the cycle will eventually come back around. So even when it can seem like hope is fading, nature reminds us that no matter what we experience, this too shall pass. Things will get better. They won't stay the same. They can't go backward, but they will cycle back somehow. And that's one reason why suicide is so tragic, because it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. The situation will change. It has to change. And yet, death robs us and all around us of the possibility of hope. Even though it can feel at times as if death is the only way out of a dilemma, nature reminds us that life is always turning in a cyclical way. The earth is spinning around the sun. The earth is spinning itself. Everything turning. It's not just the wheels on the bus that go round and round. Everything is going round and round in cycles and rhythms and seasons. If you're experiencing a dark time in your life right now, and I know a lot of people are, know with confidence that this too shall pass. Not because I say so, not because the Bible says so, which it does, but because the seasons demonstrate it for us all the time, over and over again. However, there's also something to be said about embracing the darkness in our lives. People in our technological advanced world sometimes get fooled into thinking that life is supposed to be all about light and happiness, that dark times are somehow an aberration, that life is what happens when we're not in those places, and that when we're in those places we just have to get back to living again. But nature shows us that darkness is not an anomaly. It's part of life. It's part of every life. And so we're foolish to go around just cursing the darkness, when in fact the darkness is one of our most important teachers and one of the most richest, most fertile soils out of which our spirit can grow. My colleague Marlin once wrote, "In our modern world, we are led to believe we really can have perfect lawns and wrinkle-free faces. We get fooled into believing that we can have a life without anxiety or loneliness or depression, that we can have kids that sit still and listen like polite little automatons. We are bombarded by all these promises and all these ways of fixing things, but this kind of thinking just breeds unhappiness and dissatisfaction. What is real is that we are human, that we are part of nature, that we have all kinds of feelings and all kinds of experiences, and some are pleasant and incredibly beautiful, and some are unpleasant and decidedly fearful. Our bodies are incredibly vulnerable. We will get old if we're lucky, and we will die, and everyone we know and love will too. We spend a lot of energy trying to convince ourselves and one another that life is something other than what it is. Part of life is the dark moments. I'm reminded of the story of Nasruddin, who was outside on his hands and knees, looking around under a streetlight when a friend walked up. "What are you doing?" his friend asked. "I'm looking for my key. I've lost it." And so his friend gets down on his knees, and they're both searching for a long, long time in the dirt. Finding nothing, his friend finally turned to him and asked, "Where exactly did you lose it?" And Nasruddin replied, "Well, I lost it in the house, but there's much more light out here." We human creatures have this tendency to run to the light as if that's where we will find the key to what we need. And yet, sometimes, and more often than we like to realize, that key can be found in the darkness and the dark times. And that's why we have to pay attention and remember that that too is some of the most fertile soil out of which our lives and our hope can grow. This idea was brought home to me by the story of an 85-year-old widower who came to see Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. Dr. Remen is an oncologist and psychologist who works with cancer patients. The man came to her after a long, agonizing period during which he had to decide whether to have surgery to remove cancer from one of his lungs. The doctors told him that surgery at his age and in his condition was extremely risky, but without it, the cancer would undoubtedly spread. Staring the possibility of death in the face like this caused him to live not just in immense fear, but with a deep sense of despond and sadness. It was possibly the most difficult place in his life, and it lasted for a long time, and he was having trouble gathering the will to do anything, let alone the will to have surgery. He was confused, he was disheartened, he was depressed. But by the time he came to see Dr. Remen, he had decided to go ahead with it, and he wanted to know if she knew any things that he could do to promote healing after the surgery. After she talked to him about diet and exercise and acupuncture and some Chinese herbs, she asked him what it was that finally gave him the strength to go ahead with it. He told her of a daydream that he had had a few weeks earlier. He had been sitting in his chair, reading his paper and starting to nod off. And it seemed to him that his wife had come to sit with him. She looked much as she had in the early days of their relationship. And as she looked at him, he was struck by the love that he could see in her eyes. As they sat together, he could feel his fear easing a little. And then he noticed one of his oldest friends had also come into the room and was standing behind his wife's chair. His face, too, reflected the love that had cemented their lifelong friendship. He was smiling at his friend when he saw his brother standing beside him. His eyes filled with love, too. One by one, others whose lives had touched his in loving ways were there. Family, friends, teachers, students, children and grandchildren, and even the family pet. It had been a long life, and in the end, there were more than 50 or 60 of them crowding into his living room and even into the hall. In this way, he had known that his life had been of value to many others, and found that it was of value still. No longer alone in his decision, he felt fear release him, and knew then that surgery was the right thing to do, no matter whether he survived it or not. Dr. Remen describes the tears forming in her eyes as she looked at this lovely old gentleman who was telling his story of hope being reborn in his heart. And she said, "That is so beautiful." To which he replied, "Yes, and the thing is that most of these people are dead now." He smiled at her look of surprise. "I guess anything good you've ever been given is yours forever." He nodded his head and sat quietly, smiling to himself, basking no doubt in the glow of that moment in his living room when, after a long, dark night of descent, morning had broken again. Growing out of the soil of that darkness was something that was planted inside him for a long time, but that with the darkness was able finally to flower. He came through that knowing ever more fully what his life was about and what he was about. As the Buddhists like to say, darkness is not our problem. Our rejection and denial of darkness is the real problem. It's often through our greatest difficulties that we find the world's everlasting and unquenchable light. Happy Solstice. In this season, may the light of hope and good tidings be born anew in your soul. Amen.